I'm going to be talking about James Augustus Van der Zee, who's a famous photographer from the United States. Okay, so first off, let's talk about who he was. So James Augustus Van der Zee was an American photographer who took a lot of pictures of people of color. And as you probably know, during the time where he was alive, which was the late 1800s and early 1900s, people of color weren't really as accepted as they were now. The Civil War had ended just a few years earlier, and he was most famous for taking a lot of portraits of African Americans in New York, specifically near Harlem, which is where he lived. He had a studio there as well. He has a very distinctive style of photography, which is something I'll be talking about in the following slides, and we'll also be examining some of his work. Okay. So, on June 29th, 1886, he was born in Lenox, Massachusetts, to Elizabeth and John Van de Zee. He had a very big talent for music and was considering a musical career, especially with the clarinet and the piano. However, he also had a knack for photography, and he originally got his first camera, an $8 camera, when he was a teenager, when he won in a prize pool drawing. And he loved the camera so much that he even made a darkroom inside of his parents' house. And he took hundreds of photos in his hometown of Lenox of the people who lived in his neighborhood before moving to Harlem in 1906. He had two jobs there, an elevator operator and a waiter, and he also met his wife there, and the two moved to Virginia where they got married and then they had the first child. Then he moved back to New York and became a darkroom assistant in a New Jersey department store. And eventually this culminated in 1916 where he opened his own studio in Harlem named Guaranteed Photo. Now, Vanity's work is mostly portraiture, meaning he takes pictures, he takes portraits, as you can see in these two images right here. The main subjects of these portraits were people of color in this neighborhood, and many of these people, they weren't too wealthy. They couldn't really afford to get a portrait of themselves taken usually, or at least not a good one. And we're going to be looking at a couple examples in the next couple slides, especially from these two. And we'll look back afterwards and we'll talk about the exact style that made his photographs so well liked. Okay, so in this first image, we have a photograph of two men and a woman. Notice how the background is like, it's especially similar to the background in this photograph over here. See the windows? This one, same windows, same trees. This is because this photograph was taken in a studio. And also, Van der Zee liked to use props and backgrounds in his studio to make the photographs he took more interesting or more perfect, as you like to say. He liked to give the photograph a more specific aura setting. Notice how these two guys are dressed. They're very well dressed, and they're in this very nice house, which is yet another testament to his style, which we'll talk more about later. And also, finally, look at the arrangement here of how the woman's in the middle. Fantasy, he heavily focused around women and family photographs because he believed that they were the center of a family unit, and he believed that the family unit was very important to society. Okay. Now, in this photograph, it shows again Fantasy's idea of a woman being the most important part of a family. As you can see, she's the only one in the photograph. Now, obviously, this photograph wasn't taken inside a studio. He may have gone out to somebody's house nearby, near in his neighborhood, and asked for permission to take his photograph. Or he may have been called by this woman out to her house to take a portrait of her. He wasn't always just taking photographs in the studio. And you notice in this photograph how the edges and corners of the photograph are all kind of blurry and darkened, sort of. This draws your attention to the center of the photograph where this woman is. And another interesting caveat about this photograph is that most of the dark color is concentrated around this woman. I mean, there's obviously some here and a little bit in the background, but most of it is right here, which also point your eyes towards this part of the photograph. Okay, last one. As you can see, again, background of the photograph, very soft, hazy looking. Focuses your attention on this area of the photograph here. There's a little bit of dark area down here as well. It almost gives a sort of trance-like aura to the photograph, which is one of Van der Zee's personal favorites in his editions of making photographs. You can also see that the dark color perspective is working again. As you can see, most of the color is, or the dark color rather, is concentrated around this area of the photograph. It's concentrated around these two people who are the subject of the photograph. Okay, so now that we've seen all of the technique in those photographs, let's go over exactly what he did. So he was a huge stickler for detail, and he wanted every photograph he took to be just right in his eyes. He often used gelatin silver print or sometimes sepia tone prints, which are roughly the same, but sepia tone prints are where you tint the photograph, like in this one here. It's sort of tinted to give it a better contrast and it gives it a more dreamlike appearance. And also you see faded background, so you can see the soft edges. And like I already mentioned, he makes the background and edges of the photograph a little blurry on purpose. This makes the image seem clear, it draws attention to the center where the subject is, and it adds to the dreamy experience when you sort of view these photographs. And he also believed in the family, and the family was really important. And what's the point? He believed that the maternal unit was very central to the family, most likely because of his own mother, who he had a very close relationship with, and that may have influenced his idea on photography and why he chose to put more emphasis on the woman when he took photographs of families. Okay, he also used a ton of studio props. Like you can see in most of the images, there's tables, there's chairs, this backdrop is obviously not real. And it serves to add a little bit to the scene because as you remember, Van der Zee doesn't just want to take a photograph of a guy. He wants to take a photograph of the setting, all of it, and he wants it to go a little farther beyond just a picture of somebody. And in some examples, people would have their photographs taken by Van der Zee and they show them to their friends, and their friends would say, "Well, that doesn't really look like you," and they would say, "Yeah, it really doesn't." But and that sort of charm kind of adds to the style that Van der Zee created for himself. And he didn't just do well, he did mostly photographs, but he gave up his musical career specifically so he could focus on photography. And obviously, there are other things that he did. He had his work showcased in a photographic exposition titled Harlem on My Mind in New York in 1969, which got him known around the world. And he's also a permanent member of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he was given the Living Legacy Award by Jimmy Carter, the president at the time, which is really something. You don't really know a lot of photographers that were given an accolade by the president. Later in his life, he would go on to keep making photographs, but time marches on, and as time went on, photographs and portraits got cheaper, and so did cameras. And eventually, his business simply didn't have a place in the world anymore. So he shut his studio down and went into retirement, so to speak. And then 3 years before he died, he came back to photography and he mainly took portraits of people professionally. But then on May 15th, 1983, he died of a heart attack brought on by his old age. And he lived to be 96 years old. Right. In conclusion, James Van der Zee was an amazing, talented photographer. He was one of the greats in American photography, and he was, frankly, a genius for his time. He tried to blend realism and idealism into a single image that brought photography far from the harsh realities of life without making it too silly or far-fetched, and even went beyond American history into the international books with his exhibits in Harlem on the Mind. Now, I chose this specific artist because I believe that he would be the most interesting to read and write about, and I can say with full confidence that none of it disappointed. He really was a genius and intelligent for his time. He really had some groundbreaking ideas on how the soft edges, it kind of focuses in on the color dispersion and all that. It was really interesting to read about. And on that, here's a works cited page. I'll be sure to put some of these in the description if you want to learn more.